There's something about silence that speaks louder than words, and on that particular morning at The View, the silence said everything. You could almost feel it through the screen. That hum of tension, that faint electricity that seems to fill the air right before something unforgettable happens. I remember watching that opening shot, and even before anyone spoke, I thought, something's off. Brad Pitt, Hollywood's unshakable calm himself, walked into the studio like he always does. Effortless, cool, and with that aura of quiet control that's made him one of the most composed public figures in the business. But this wasn't a red carpet or a movie premiere. This was The View, a table built for confrontation, surrounded by women who make a living out of asking the questions everyone else tiptoes around. And this time, they weren't just interviewing an actor. They were testing the limits of a man who's spent decades trying not to lose his composure in front of the world. From the first moment, the energy was different. You could see it on the crew's faces, in the way people were whispering backstage, even in the way the audience sat. Expectant, almost nervous. The lights were brighter than usual, or maybe it just felt that way. The cameras zoomed in. The floor manager signaled with 2 fingers, and suddenly the chatter quieted. It was showtime. Now, I've seen a lot of interviews go sideways, but this one had a build-up like a movie scene. Slow, deliberate, and crackling with the kind of quiet tension that makes you lean forward in your seat. Brad sat down in that signature posture. Relaxed shoulders, easy smile, eyes that looked calm but carried that sharp, knowing glint. The kind that says he's always 10 steps ahead. He was dressed simply, gray blazer, crisp white shirt, the kind of outfit that looks casual but costs more than a car payment. He smiled politely, greeted the hosts, and for a moment, it felt like just another press stop. You know, the kind where actors show up, tell a few rehearsed anecdotes, flash their trademark charm, and move on to the next studio. But right away, I could tell that wasn't going to be the case. Sunny Hostin, seated across from him, had that look. The look of a journalist who's not just here to flatter, but to challenge. Her notes were perfectly organized, her pen aligned beside them like a soldier waiting for command. Her body language was calm, precise, but her eyes, they were fixed on him with laser focus. She wasn't there for small talk. She was waiting for her moment. When the red light on the camera blinked to life, the studio applause erupted, polite, familiar, the kind of noise that fills the awkward space before conversation begins. Whoopi Goldberg, the anchor of calm in this often chaotic show, started the segment the way she always does. Warm, friendly, guiding the conversation into safe, predictable waters. They talked about Brad's new film, about the creative process, about what it means to tell stories in today's world. The first few minutes were light. Laughter, reminiscing, comfort. Joy Behar threw in a playful jab about Brad's early modeling days, and he chuckled the way only Brad Pitt can. Effortlessly charming, like he's laughing with the world instead of at it. The audience adored it. For a while, it all felt easy. But the thing about The View is that calm never lasts long. And honestly, that's why people tune in. Beneath the laughter and the bright studio lights, there's always an edge. That undercurrent of tension that says at any moment, someone might push just a little too far. And that's exactly what happened. When Sunny finally leaned forward, it was almost imperceptible, a shift so subtle you might miss it if you weren't paying attention. Her voice was soft even, but there was steel underneath it. She asked, "Brad, you've been one of Hollywood's most respected figures for decades, but some critics say you choose your moments, that you stay silent on big industry issues until it's convenient. Do you think that's fair?" Now, that might sound like a regular question, professional, balanced. But if you know how interviews work, you know that kind of question is a loaded weapon disguised as curiosity. It's one of those inquiries that forces a guest to choose between honesty and image, between staying safe or risking everything with one wrong sentence. The entire tone of the room changed in an instant. The laughter from seconds before evaporated. The audience's smiles froze mid-expression. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was thick, alive. You could feel every pair of eyes locked on Brad, waiting for his reaction. I swear, even the cameras seemed to lean in closer. Brad paused, just for a second, but it was long enough to say more than words ever could. His jaw tightened ever so slightly, his expression thoughtful but wary. That's the thing about him. He's mastered the art of saying a lot by saying very little. He looked at Sunny, his voice steady. "I think everyone decides how they use their voice," he said, with that calm confidence that comes from years of training. Sometimes, real change doesn't happen in front of a microphone. It was measured, smart. The kind of answer that keeps you out of headlines while still sounding profound. But Sunny didn't flinch. She tilted her head, eyes sharp, her tone still calm, but her words sharper than ever. "But when people don't see you speak," she said, "they assume you're choosing not to." Doesn't silence, especially from someone with your platform, send its own message? Oof, that was the hit. The one that makes the air shift. The one that takes a polite conversation and turns it into a test. The audience shifted in their seats. Some people gasped softly. Others murmured under their breath. You could feel the discomfort ripple through the studio. And if you looked closely, you could see it. The faint twitch at the corner of Brad's mouth. The flicker of frustration just beneath his calm exterior. He smiled. That tight, polite smile that doesn't reach the eyes. "I don't see silence as complicity," he said. "There are conversations that matter, ones that don't need an audience." Now, as a viewer, I could see both sides. I understood what Sunny was trying to get at. That idea that public figures have a responsibility to speak up, to use their platforms for something more than promotion. But I also understood Brad's exhaustion. The constant pressure of being told that silence equals guilt, that every move has to mean something. Sunny didn't let up. She kept her tone calm, but there was no mistaking the push in her words. "But the public doesn't witness private conversations," she countered. "What they see is you, the public figure, staying out of the discussion. Isn't that a privilege in itself?" And that word, privilege, that's when it really hit a nerve. It's one of those words that carries weight, that people don't throw around lightly, especially not on live television. The second she said it, you could see Brad's body language change. His back straightened, his eyes narrowed ever so slightly. He repeated the word under his breath, as if testing it for sharp edges. "That's a big word to throw around in a 5-minute segment," he said finally. His voice was calm, but there was an edge in it. That kind of restrained irritation that tells you he's holding back. Sunny gave a small, polite smile. "It's a big topic," she replied simply. And that was the spark. The subtle beginning of what would become one of the most intense celebrity interviews of the year. I remember watching this live and thinking, this isn't just about an interview anymore. This is about something deeper. You could see it in Brad's posture. His shoulders shifted slightly forward, his tone a little firmer. "Look," he said, "I came here to talk about my work. The film, the causes I support, not to defend myself against what you think I should be saying." The air cracked. It was that rare kind of tension that doesn't just exist in the room. It travels through the screen. You could feel the discomfort of every host, the hesitation of the audience, the way everyone suddenly sat a little too still. Joy Behar tried to step in, probably sensing that the conversation was teetering on the edge, but Sunny gently raised a hand, signaling she wasn't finished. "I'm not attacking you," she said softly. "I'm asking what the public wonders when they don't hear from you. People look up to you, Brad." And this is where I think everything changed for him. He exhaled slowly, his gaze narrowing slightly. "And maybe that's the problem," he said. "We've started treating actors like moral authorities. I tell stories. That's my job." And boom, that line it hit like a confession and a defense all at once. Because let's be honest, he wasn't wrong. We do put celebrities on pedestals, expecting them to be philosophers, politicians, and moral compasses, all while they're just trying to do their jobs. But in that moment, Sunny's next response turned that truth into a challenge. "But staying neutral," she said quietly, That's still a choice. And that's when Brad's calm, that famous, unshakable calm, finally cracked. His eyes flashed. His tone dropped. "Don't tell me what neutrality is." The crowd gasped. And right there, that was the moment. The mask slipped, the camera zoomed in just enough to catch it. That flicker of real emotion, the kind that can't be rehearsed or smoothed over. It wasn't rage exactly, it was exhaustion, frustration, maybe even a hint of hurt. The years of pressure, the headlines, the expectation to always say the right thing. It all seemed to hit him at once. And as the audience sat frozen, and the co-hosts exchanged uneasy glances, one thing became clear. This wasn't just an interview anymore. It was a breaking point, not just for Brad Pitt, but for the illusion of control that so many celebrities fight to maintain. Whoopi, ever the voice of reason, leaned forward slightly and said in that calm, grounding tone of hers, "Let's all breathe here. This is a conversation, not a cage match." But even she knew. This was bigger than conversation, because what everyone saw that day wasn't just a movie star defending himself. It was a man, tired of being defined by the noise around him. And as the show cut to its first commercial break, the air in that studio didn't lighten. Nobody laughed, nobody exhaled. It was the kind of silence that lingers, heavy, uncomfortable, unforgettable. I remember sitting there, watching the screen fade to black, thinking, this wasn't over, not by a long shtice. So here's where things started to turn. Up until this point, everything looked textbook perfect. Brad was charming, the audience was eating it up, the hosts were smiling, and even the transitions felt smooth. You know, that easy rhythm that talk shows have. Laughter at all the right cues, quick back-and-forth banter, the kind of flow that says, "We've done this 1,000 times." That's exactly how it felt. But there's a moment, and if you rewatch the clip, you can see it. You can actually feel the air change. It's not dramatic at first. No music shift, no obvious cue, but it's there. It happens right when Sunny Hostin leans forward ever so slightly. Her body language changes first. You notice it in her shoulders, that quiet, centered confidence that means she's about to ask something that matters. She's not being confrontational. Not yet. She's being deliberate. Her tone drops half an octave, her words slow down, and she asks, "Brad, you've been one of Hollywood's most respected figures for decades, but some critics say you pick and choose when to speak, that you stay silent on important issues until it's convenient. Do you think that's fair?" And I swear you could have heard a pin drop. The camera cuts to Brad, and for a fraction of a second, and I mean a fraction, there's a flicker in his expression. His polite smile falters just enough to tell you that he heard the edge in her question, not the words, the intention behind them. And that's the thing about live TV. You can't hide energy. You can hide your words. You can choose them carefully. You can put on a polite smile. But energy? That's what gives everything away. Now, here's the part that gets me. Because this wasn't just some throwaway question. It wasn't a tabloid dig. It was something deeper. It was a challenge to the entire way Brad Pitt has chosen to exist in Hollywood. And that's a heavy thing to unpack on a show built around quick takes and daytime chatter. You could see the other hosts glance at each other for just a moment. Whoopi shifted in her chair. Joy looked down at her cue card. Little signals that say, "Okay, this might go somewhere we didn't plan." Brad's initial reaction was measured. He did what he's always done best. He took a breath, straightened slightly, and gave that thoughtful half-smile. "Well," he said, pausing just long enough to make everyone lean in a little closer, "I've spent most of my career trying to focus on the work. I'm not a pundit. I'm not here to give speeches. But it seems like no matter what I do, somebody wants to tell me I'm doing it wrong." And that's when I realized he wasn't dodging, he was defending. But Sunny didn't back off. She nodded, but there was steel in her gaze. "I don't think anyone's saying you're doing it wrong," she said softly. "I think they're asking you to recognize the power you have. A voice like yours can change the way millions of people think. That's not criticism, that's responsibility." And I've got to admit, that line hit. It really did. Because if you think about it, Sunny wasn't wrong when you're Brad Pitt, when your image, your voice, your silence even, can shape public opinion. You're not just an actor anymore. You're an influence machine, whether you ask to be or not. The room felt tense, but it wasn't ugly. Not yet. It was the kind of tension that feels like two truths pressing against each other. On one hand, you had Brad, a man who's spent years avoiding being labeled as anything beyond an artist. Someone who's made it clear that he values privacy, that he doesn't want to be turned into a mouthpiece for Hollywood's politics. And honestly, I get that. When you're constantly under the microscope, sometimes silence is the only control you have left. On the other hand, you had Sunny, a woman who's built her reputation on accountability, on speaking truth to power, on calling things out, even when it's uncomfortable. And she was doing exactly what people expect her to do, asking the question that everyone else was too nervous to. The beauty of this moment is how real it felt. No one was performing. You could feel that both sides believed what they were saying. Brad wasn't being arrogant. He was being honest. And Sunny wasn't being combative. She was being firm. It was a conversation that needed to happen, but it was happening under the harshest light possible. Live television. Now, let me be honest here. As a viewer, I felt torn. Part of me understood where Brad was coming from. I mean, think about it. He's lived decades being told who he is, what he should say, who he should date, and what his legacy means. Sometimes maybe silence isn't avoidance, maybe it's survival. But then again, Sunny had a point. The world has changed, audiences expect authenticity. They want their heroes to stand for something, especially in times when silence can be mistaken for indifference. The tension between those two realities, personal privacy and public responsibility, is what made this exchange so electric. It wasn't shouting, it wasn't messy, it was controlled fire. As Brad started to respond again, his tone changed just slightly. You could hear a little more edge creeping in. Not anger, just defensiveness wrapped in composure. He said, "I've always believed that the best way to make an impact is through your work, not through interviews. I'm not trying to play politics. I'm trying to tell stories that matter." That line, "stories that matter," was so intentional. It was his quiet way of saying, "I'm not ignoring the world, I'm just engaging with it differently." But Sunny wasn't done. She leaned in again, and this time, her voice softened. "I hear you," she said, "but don't you think stories can inspire people only if they know where the storyteller stands?" And that's when it clicked. This wasn't about politics. It was about connection, about the gap between who celebrities think they are and who the world needs them to be. Now I've seen so many interviews spiral at this point. Voices raised, awkward jokes, producers frantically signaling to cut to commercial. But what happened next was something else entirely. Brad didn't explode. He didn't retreat. He just paused. And for a few seconds, he looked down at the table, his fingers tracing the edge of his coffee cup. That silence spoke louder than any statement he could have made. It was the silence of someone weighing two worlds, the one where he protects his peace, and the one where he uses his voice. And I think, in that moment, even Sunny saw it, because her expression shifted. Her eyes softened, just a little. That's what makes this conversation so fascinating to me. It wasn't a gotcha moment. It was a mirror, two perspectives reflecting back at each other, both valid, both uncomfortable. When you really think about it, this is the cost of fame no one talks about enough. Everyone glorifies the red carpets, the awards, the influence. But the truth is, once the world gives you a platform, it also gives you a burden. People stop seeing you and start seeing what you represent. And that's the space Brad found himself in, live, under those studio lights. I've replayed that segment multiple times, and every single time, I notice something new. The way Joy's smile tightens, the way the audience shifts in their seats, the way Whoopi subtly redirects the energy before it boils over. You can almost see the producers behind the glass, probably whispering frantically into headsets, "Do we cut? Do we keep it?" But they didn't cut. They let it breathe. And that, to me, was the smartest choice possible. Because what unfolded in those next few minutes was something rare, raw, respectful, but undeniably charged. You could feel everyone holding their breath, waiting to see if Brad would push back harder, if Sunny would dig deeper, or if they'd somehow find common ground in the middle of that tension. And that's the beauty of live TV at its best. It captures truth in real time. It doesn't give people a chance to edit, to retreat, to reshape the narrative. It shows you who they are in the moment. And that's exactly what we were seeing. Not Brad Pitt, the movie star, not Sunny Hostin, the journalist, but two human beings trying to define what it means to have power, to use it, or to hold it quietly. By the time they moved on to the next segment, the audience finally exhaled. The laughter returned, the energy softened, and things went back to normal, at least on the surface. But if you watched closely, you could tell neither of them had truly moved on. Brad's smile was still there, but his eyes were distant. Sunny was back in her professional rhythm, but her mind was still working through what had just been said. And honestly, that's what made it so unforgettable. Because that exchange wasn't just about one question. It was about a generational divide, a philosophical clash, and a very human struggle between safety and responsibility. I think that's why it went viral later. Not because anyone won the conversation, but because everyone watching could see themselves in it. That inner tug of war between wanting to protect your peace and wanting to stand for something bigger. That's the thing about moments like this. They don't just entertain you, they unsettle you, they make you think. And for Brad Pitt, a man who's built an entire career on quiet intensity, this was the moment where silence itself became the loudest statement of, when the show cut to its next segment, most viewers probably thought the moment had passed. The laughter came back. The audience clapped again, and the hosts slipped into their usual rhythm, the kind that keeps everything looking easy and controlled. But if you were watching closely, like really watching, you could tell something had shifted. You could feel it in the way Brad sat, in the way his hands rested a little too still on the table, in the way his smile seemed to arrive a second too late. See, that's the thing about moments like this. They don't end when the topic changes. They linger. They settle into the room, into the body language, into the air between people. And no matter how many jokes or commercials you throw over it, that tension stays there, just waiting for the right spark to reignite it. And in my opinion, that spark came way sooner than anyone expected. After the break, Joy Behar decided to lighten the mood. Or at least, that's what it seemed like she was trying to do. She looked over at Brad with that teasing glint in her eye and said, "You know, Brad, I've got to ask, how does someone stay this calm when the whole world's watching? Because if someone had asked me that question, I'd be flipping this table." It got a laugh, of course. The audience needed it. Even Whoopi chuckled, but Brad's reaction was telling. He laughed too, but it was tight, polite. Not defensive, just restrained. Like he understood the joke, but also the truth behind it. He looked at Joy and said quietly, "Well, I've learned that sometimes calm isn't calm, it's just control." And I swear, that line hung in the air like smoke. That was the moment, right there, when I realized this interview was peeling back layers of Brad Pitt that the public rarely sees. For years, we've known him as the composed one, the professional, the guy who never really lets the cracks show. But live television, especially a show like The View, doesn't care about composure. It tests it. It teases it until it starts to crumble. And honestly, I think Brad felt that happening in real time. Because after that, the conversation drifted into the broader topic of fame, how public scrutiny affects creativity, and whether Hollywood has become too performative. And this is where Brad started to open up in a way that felt raw, maybe even a little unguarded. He said, "You spend so long being watched that you start curating yourself, even when you don't mean to. It's like you stop reacting as a person and start responding as a brand. You forget what's honest and what's strategic." And as he said that, Sunny nodded slowly. The camera caught her face, not skeptical this time, but thoughtful. Like maybe she was starting to understand that this wasn't just about silence or speaking out. It was about survival in an industry that punishes both. And look, I'll be honest, I've thought about that line a lot since I watched the clip. Because it's so easy for us, as fans or viewers, to demand authenticity from celebrities. We say we want them to be real, vulnerable, unfiltered. But the truth is, the second they show something raw, we tear it apart. We analyze it, we meme it, we turn it into content. So maybe what Brad was saying wasn't just an excuse. Maybe it was an indictment of the whole system. Sunny picked up on that too. She leaned forward again, this time with a softer tone. "That's fair," she said. "But don't you think the audience also wants to see the person behind the image? Not the brand, but the man." And you could see something flicker in Brad's eyes when she said that. Because for a moment, just a moment, it looked like she hit something personal. He took a breath, nodded slightly, and said, "Yeah, but sometimes the man's just trying to breathe." And that line, I don't know about you, but it broke me a little because it was so human. You could feel the exhaustion in it, the quiet frustration of someone who's spent decades being dissected, who's learned to hide his inner life just to protect what's left of it. The audience went quiet again. Not awkward quiet, respectful quiet, like they sensed they were witnessing something real, something unscripted. Whoopi, being the seasoned moderator she is, stepped in to steer things back gently. "You know," she said, "that's something I've said for years. People don't always understand that fame doesn't come with emotional armor." Brad gave her this little half smile, the kind that says thank you for that. But he didn't speak. And that silence, it was heavy, but in a beautiful way. Like everyone was collectively processing what had just been said. Now, here's where the brilliance of live TV comes in. It doesn't let moments like that rest for long. Because right after that deep, almost philosophical pause, the show producer's voice cuts in through Joy's earpiece, and the conversation shifts again. Suddenly, they're talking about Brad's charity work, his recent projects, the lighter stuff. But his tone doesn't bounce back. You can see it in the replay. The smile's still there, but his energy has changed. His words feel slower, more deliberate. It's like he's still half in that other moment, the one he can't quite leave behind. And honestly, I get it. Because when someone asks you to confront the difference between who you are and who the world thinks you are, you don't just switch gears and talk about your next film. That's emotional whiplash. But here's what's wild. That's exactly why the internet exploded over this interview later. It wasn't because Brad snapped, or Sunny pushed too hard, or there was some big blow-up. It was because people recognized themselves in that exhaustion. You'd scroll through the comments and see things like, "He looks tired," or "He's finally letting the mask slip," or "This was the realest interview I've ever seen him give." And I think that's the thing. We crave those cracks in perfection. We want to see the human behind the myth, even if it makes us uncomfortable. Now, not everyone saw it that way. Some viewers felt Brad was being overly sensitive, that as one of the most powerful people in Hollywood, he should expect to be challenged. Others argued that Sunny's question was necessary, that it wasn't personal. It was accountability. And you know what? I actually think both sides are right, because this wasn't a story with a villain. It was a clash between two very valid truths. Brad represented that quiet kind of strength. The artist who believes his work should speak for itself, Sunny represented the modern demand for transparency. The idea that silence, in itself, can be a statement. The real magic was in how those two truths collided without hatred, without chaos, just raw human tension. There's this moment later in the interview that almost gets overlooked because it's so subtle. It's after they've moved on. After things have cooled, Brad glances down at his hands and starts to say something, but he stops himself. You can see the words form and then vanish. He just nods slightly instead. And I think that's when he realized he'd already said everything that needed to be said. That right there, that restraint, says more about him than any prepared answer ever could. It's the difference between reacting and reflecting, between talking and understanding. I've got to say, Watching that play out made me think about how much pressure we put on people to always have the perfect response. Sometimes silence isn't avoidance, it's processing. You can almost see Brad choosing silence in that moment, not because he didn't care, but because he did. And that's what makes this interview so fascinating in hindsight. It wasn't explosive, it was introspective. But it still hit harder than most public meltdowns we see online, because it wasn't about spectacle, it was about truth. By the time the episode wrapped up, you could tell the mood had shifted in the studio. The applause at the end felt softer, more thoughtful. And when Brad stood up to leave, Sunny extended her hand. He shook it, not with fake TV energy, but with genuine respect, and you could almost see her say, "Thanks for going there." Because, in a weird way, they both did. They both stepped into a conversation that most celebrities, and most interviewers, are too afraid to have. It's the kind of exchange that doesn't end when the camera's cut. It lingers. It makes people talk. It makes you think. And that's why, in my opinion, this wasn't a PR disaster or a confrontation. It was a cultural moment. A reminder that even the most put-together people have limits, and even the most outspoken hosts have empathy. What we saw that day wasn't a man being attacked, it was a man being seen, maybe too clearly, maybe before he was ready, but seen nonetheless. And that's what makes it powerful. Because if you strip away the fame, the cameras, the politics, what's left are two people trying to bridge the space between public image and private truth. And I think that's something every one of us can relate to, whether we're in Hollywood or not. When the studio lights finally dimmed and the credits rolled, the air in that room felt different. It wasn't the kind of energy that usually follows a high-profile interview. Normally, there's applause, smiles, little moments of relief when everyone knows they've pulled off a good show. But that day, it felt heavier. Like everyone had witnessed something that wasn't supposed to happen. Something too raw, too real, to just move past. Brad walked off set quietly. No dramatic gestures, no anger, no words thrown over his shoulder. Just quiet. Controlled. But you could tell that control was holding something together, something fragile. The audience sat frozen for a few beats after he disappeared backstage. Even Whoopi, a professional who's seen it all, didn't rush to fill the silence. She just looked down for a second, exhaled, and said softly, "All right, folks, that's live TV." It was a simple sentence, but everyone in the room knew it meant so much more. And you know what? That silence after he left, that was the moment that told you everything. Because in show business, silence is rare. Normally there's chatter, laughter, chaos. But here, you could have heard a pin drop. That kind of quiet doesn't happen when something goes wrong. It happens when something real happens behind the scenes, though, chaos. Pure chaos. Producers were moving fast, whispering into headsets, trying to figure out how to handle the optics. Some thought they should edit the replay before airing. Others argued that they should leave it untouched. Authenticity sells, after all. Meanwhile, on social media, things were already spiraling the moment Brad stood up, hadn't even finished airing on the West Coast, before clips began flooding online. Someone from the studio audience had recorded the exact second his chair scraped the floor. Within minutes, it was everywhere. And let me tell you, the internet lives for moments like this. Within an hour, hashtags started trending. Our Brad Pitt walks off. Brad vs. Sunny. The View meltdown. By lunchtime, every entertainment outlet, from ET to Variety, had published some version of the story. Brad Pitt storms off The View after heated exchange. Sunny Hostin challenges Brad Pitt, and he snaps. Hollywood's coolest star finally loses his composure. You could almost feel the headlines racing to out-dramatize each other. But here's the thing. Most of those articles missed the point. Because it wasn't about a man snapping. It wasn't about ego or anger or bad press. It was about exhaustion. Emotional, spiritual exhaustion. Brad's walk-off wasn't an explosion. It was a release. A human moment in an industry that rarely allows them, and fans noticed that. When you went through the comments on YouTube or TikTok that night, it wasn't just gossip or jokes. It was empathy. People wrote things like, "He didn't walk away because he was angry. He walked away because he's tired." Or, "That's what happens when people forget that celebrities are human too." Others were less forgiving. Some said, "He has privilege. He can walk away. Ordinary people can't." And that's the thing about these moments. They divide people. Everyone projects their own truth onto them. In my opinion, that's why this particular clip hit so hard. Because it wasn't just Brad and Sunny. It was us. It was every argument about voice, privilege, silence, and responsibility playing out in real time. And whether you agreed with him or not, you couldn't look away. Backstage tension. While the internet was busy dissecting every frame of the clip, backstage at The View, things were tense. Crew members avoided eye contact. Sunny sat still in her chair for almost a full minute after the cameras cut. She didn't speak. She didn't even move. She just stared down at her notes, those same notes that had started it all. Joy tried to lighten the mood again, muttering something about another day in daytime TV, but even she knew it wasn't the time. Whoopi eventually reached over and said quietly, "You okay?" Sunny nodded once. "Yeah, I didn't mean for it to go that way." And I believe her, because if you've watched Sunny Hostin long enough, you know she doesn't provoke for entertainment. She provokes for truth. That's her whole thing. She's calm, but she cuts deep. The problem is, that kind of honesty doesn't always land the way it's intended, especially when the person across the table is someone who's been under a microscope for 30 years. Brad didn't give any post-show interviews. He didn't release a statement, he just left. One producer later described it as the quietest exit I've ever seen. No shouting, no slammed doors. Just a man walking out of a conversation he no longer wanted to be part of. And honestly, I think that silence said more than any PR-crafted apology ever could. The internet takes sides by nightfall. Everyone had chosen a side. On one end, there were fans defending Brad, saying he was brave for setting boundaries, for not letting himself be cornered into a conversation he didn't sign up for. People flooded social media with old clips of him doing charity work, helping rebuild homes in New Orleans, supporting humanitarian causes quietly, without cameras. One fan posted, "The man literally built houses after Katrina and didn't make a documentary about it. Stop acting like he doesn't care." That comment alone racked up hundreds of thousands of likes. On the other side, there were people praising Sunny, calling her fearless for asking the questions that needed to be asked. Tweets like, "Sunny Hostin didn't attack him. She asked what accountability looks like for a man in power," started circulating. Journalists weighed in. Opinion pieces popped up overnight. The conversation grew bigger than just that one interview. It became about celebrity activism, male privilege, and the expectations we put on public figures. And the irony? The exact thing Brad said would happen, the message getting buried under the noise, happened instantly. Because instead of people talking about the film he came to promote, or the causes he quietly supports, everyone was talking about the argument. The storm had swallowed the story whole. Inside the machine now. I've worked around this industry long enough to know how fast the machine spins when something like this happens. The PR calls start immediately. Teams go into crisis mode. They start drafting clarifications, damage control statements, and perfectly worded posts designed to cool things off. But Brad didn't play that game. No tweet, no statement, no publicist quote, nothing. And that silence, that choice not to speak, only made people talk more. Some saw it as strength. Others saw it as avoidance. But to me, it felt like integrity. Because sometimes, the most powerful response is no response, especially when you know that anything you say will just feed the cycle. It reminded me of something an old studio publicist once said. The moment you try to explain the truth to the internet, you've already lost. The internet doesn't want truth, it wants sides. And that's exactly what this became. A cultural Rorschach test. Everyone saw something different in the same 5-minute clip Sunny speaks. A few days later, Sunny finally addressed it on air. Not dramatically, not as an apology, just calmly at the top of the show, she said, "Sometimes conversations get harder than we expect, but the purpose of this table has always been honesty, and honesty isn't always comfortable. No mention of Brad's name, no blame, just a statement of principle, and I thought, that's classy, that's restraint." Whoopi added, "We love Brad. He's welcome back anytime. Sometimes people need a minute, and that's okay." And that line right there, that's what makes The View what it is. It's messy, it's unpredictable, but it's real. It's one of the few places on television where you can actually see the collision between celebrity and conscience play out in real time. The deeper meaning. But let's zoom out for a second. Because beyond the gossip, beyond the trending hashtags, there's something bigger happening here. Something worth thinking about. This wasn't just about Brad Pitt. It wasn't even just about Sunny Hostin. It was about the impossible expectations we put on people in the spotlight. We want our celebrities to be humble, but vocal, private, but transparent. Flawed, but perfect enough to be our role models. It's an impossible tightrope, and moments like this expose just how thin that wire really is. Brad represented one side of that struggle. The artist who believes his work is his message, Sunny represented the other. The journalist who believes silence from the powerful is a form of complicity. Both are valid. Both are complicated, and both collided in that studio under lights too bright to hide the truth. In my opinion, that's what made this interview resonate far beyond the gossip cycle. It wasn't about who was right. It was about how truth looks different depending on where you're standing. The public reaction evolves. By the end of the week, the story had evolved into something more reflective. Think pieces started appearing in cultural magazines and op-eds. People began discussing not just the interview, but what it symbolized. Some saw it as a generational clash, the old Hollywood philosophy of mystery versus the modern culture of transparency. Others saw it as a gender dynamic, a man being challenged by a strong, articulate woman on live television and not knowing how to navigate it. But I think, at its core, it was about humanity. About how we expect people to always have the right answer, especially when the world sees them as symbols instead of souls. And when Brad said, "I'm done proving myself to strangers who think they know who I am," that hit home for millions of people. Because it's not just celebrities who feel that way, it's anyone who's ever been misunderstood, misjudged, or asked to perform a version of themselves that isn't real. That's why this story refused to die down. It became a mirror. Quiet redemption. Interestingly, a few weeks later, Brad reappeared publicly, not for a talk show, not for an interview, but at a charity event in New Orleans. No press, no entourage, just him showing up, shaking hands, helping raise funds for housing projects. Someone snapped a photo of him laughing with a local builder. It went viral instantly, not because of the charity, but because of the caption someone wrote beneath it. The man who walked off The View, walking back into what actually matters. And maybe that's the truth of it. Maybe that moment on The View wasn't a breakdown. Maybe it was a breakthrough. A moment where he finally stopped performing for the world and started protecting his peace. Sometimes you have to walk away from the noise to stay true to yourself. And that, to me, is not weakness. That's strength. A final reflection. In the end, that's what this entire saga came down to. Not who won or lost, but what it revealed. Sunny Hostin didn't lose for asking hard questions. Brad Pitt didn't lose for refusing to answer them on someone else's terms. They both stood for something. They both showed us the weight of expectation. And in that collision, uncomfortable, emotional, human, we got a glimpse of something incredibly rare. Truth without script. Because no matter how polished Hollywood becomes, no matter how carefully crafted an image is, authenticity will always find a way to break through. Sometimes it happens in the most unplanned, unflattering, unpredictable ways. Like on live television, when a man finally lets the mask slip and says, "Enough." And maybe, just maybe, that was the most honest performance of his